Hi there, everybody. Thank you for coming back to another episode of VolcaKnowledge. Whether you're listening or watching with us today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Natalie Starkey, who's with us today. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, no problem at all. So Natalie is going to take us out of this world today. Natalie is a geologist, cosmochemist, outreach officer, and popular science author. So Natalie, it'd be great to hear a bit about your background and how you've got to where you are today.
Goodness, yeah, that's kind of a long story at this point. I guess I'll start where I am right now, which I'm currently working at the Open University as a science communicator in physical sciences. So the funny thing is I'm leading kind of the science communication for physics, which is weird because I don't have a physics background. I didn't even study physics post 16. So my last physics was literally GCSE and I did well, but I didn't study it since then. So it does seem like a weird job for me to be doing now, but the way I got there was really from actually starting out by studying geology at A-level and then through a degree, and I did geochemistry, and then I moved into space science research as I got into kind of my actual research career. And that was in the physical sciences department of the Open University. So I have this kind of weird route from having studied volcanoes in the beginning and having an absolute love of volcanoes to moving out into space and wanting to understand rocks in space. And they were from comets and asteroids. And so I've got kind of this weird rounded knowledge of all the rocks in the solar system, but then moving into now physics and helping our physicists and our space scientists and our astronomers tell their stories about their research in science. So it's useful to have that kind of really kind of rounded background knowledge. But, you know, if I'm talking to quantum physicists, they're having to tell me a lot of what they do because I don't know anything about that. But I think that's kind of useful in some respects. I can, you know, say to them, that doesn't make any sense. How are we going to explain this to, you know, the public that we're speaking to? So, yeah, it's been quite a long route through. But I just love what I'm doing right now. I love kind of telling these science stories and really delving in and trying to understand all these different types of science. It's really cool. That's
awesome. And as you say, with what you're doing, you're having to learn yourself along the way. And that's something that maybe we don't always still consider about as scientists, that no, we should go into, you know, slightly different fields and put ourselves out of our comfort zone to an area that's maybe not as familiar, because it helps us step back and realize, okay, what is the message we want to convey to a larger audience?
Definitely. And I think like it's just one of those things, like I've always said to people as I've gone through my career, I didn't really know when I took each step, like what I was going to be doing. And I've done a kind of internships along the way. I went into an oil company for a while because I was a geologist, and that's what geologists do. They go in mining and oil, and it just wasn't for me. And I had a great time. I worked up in Aberdeen, and I got to see that side of industry, but, discovered it wasn't for me. I then went to do my PhD and I followed my passion of volcanoes. And actually, when I finished that internship, they gave me this massive book on volcanoes. It was like this, it's literally like A3, and you open it up, it's like double A3 size. It's these beautiful images of volcanoes. And they just knew that was my passion. They were like, you need to go and do your PhD because you love this stuff. So, I went into that, and then moving into my career into my research career, it was a massive leap to go into space science because, I'd only ever studied the Earth and volcanoes on Earth. And so it was really scary for me to jump into a whole new field. But actually, it was the best thing I ever did because I got to combine kind of all this knowledge about Earth's volcanoes and look at space and all the rocks there. And I think that's completely led on to what I'm doing now. Little did I know, at the time that, I'd end up writing books about this stuff. But, that you just can't predict what's going to happen in the future.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think this is the perfect time for you to introduce your book. I've got my copy right here.
Brilliant.
So
thank you.
This is Fire and Ice, the Volcanoes of the Solar System. So as you just said, this is the perfect culmination of what you've done throughout your research career.
Yeah, it's funny because I started out, I wrote a book before this. So my first popular science book is called Catching Stardust, and it was all about comets and asteroids. So it was very much about the research I was doing post PhD, where, my first proper paid research position. And I just put kind of all my knowledge about comets and asteroids into that book. But yeah, I kind of felt like I hadn't done what I wanted to do because I was like, I actually want to write about volcanoes. And then I spoke to my publisher and I was like, I'd really like to write about volcanoes. And they were like, well, we're not sure about just a volcano book on Earth, because there's a lot of that already. So, would you think about writing it about volcanoes in space? And I was like, well, I've never actually studied volcanoes in space. I know a lot about them, and I know loads of researchers that have worked on different volcanoes out there. But so that was where it really led me to do a massive research project for the book, because, I knew about Earth and all the stuff that happens here and how volcanoes form and why the Earth is the way it is. But then moving into space, everything's so different. And so it was really fun for me kind of going back, delving back into the research literature and finding all those papers and learning myself all about these places. It was a really fascinating way to write a book, actually.
So for that first book you did then, something that was a bit more familiar, what was that drive from you to decide, I've spent a lot of time working in the research, I want to write a popular science book about this? Because I don't think it's something that many of us think about doing. We think about ways that we can do outreach and impact of our research in the community, but writing a book is not the most popular route in that sense.
No,
so what
definitely
what enticed you to do that?
Well, it's a ton of work as well. Like, I wouldn't recommend writing a book to people. It's so much work. You don't make much money. That's not the reason you do it. You do it because you just feel like you need to write this book. And it wasn't like I just, that was the first thing I'd done in science communication. I'd spent since my PhD, I'd spent a lot of time in schools and speaking to the public and just going out and talking about my research. So that was what I'd been doing for, 7 or 10 years before I wrote the book. And for me, that allowed me to really practice what I did. It made me learn how to explain my science, because the first time you go out, kids ask you the best questions and often you can't answer them. You go into a group of maybe 10-year-olds and they just have the most fantastic questions, and sometimes they completely stump you and you're like, oh my goodness, I really need to know my subject better, down to this level that the questions you kind of get from the public, simple things that you think you should know, you're like, oh, I didn't know that. So it really makes you read up about your subject and just be confident that you can then go out and try and answer any question. But also, we're not completely infallible, we can't answer everything, and I like to tell people that if they ask me a question I can't answer, I'm fine with that. I'm like, well, I don't know everything. This is something that, we'll try and find out together or something like that. So, I did spend a lot of time kind of honing my skills, let's say. And I also did an internship with The Guardian, which was an amazing opportunity. And that was through the British Science Association. And I don't think they run the scheme any longer, sadly, but it allowed researchers to go out to media organizations for the summer pretty much. And you were paid to be, on one of these teams. So I was on the science and environment team with The Guardian, learning from some of the best people in the business, reporting on cutting edge news stories and having to write articles, literally all to the timeframes that they work to, which is completely different to how we work in academia and in science research. Like, it's deadlines, and it's really scary. But I absolutely loved the rush of that. It was very stressful and so different to what I was used to, but it allowed me to practice kind of understanding loads of different types of science and trying to report on them as best I could. I think I ended up with 30 articles over 2 months in The Guardian, which is just amazing. You're like, the pace of work is just so different to what I was used to. So, all of these things sort of led me to where I eventually got to writing the book. I didn't just come along and write a book. I don't think it's that easy.
Yeah. Was it a suggestion from someone, or was it your own?
It was a publisher had been contacting me for a number of years because I'd been lucky enough to be involved in the Rosetta mission. So this was this mission to Comet 67P, and it landed on the comet in 2014. Now, I was kind of on the science team for one of the Open University instruments that they had on board. And this was basically an instrument that was on the lander, and it was going to be sniffing the gases that were coming off the comet. Now, the team, the instrument was built way before I even joined the Open University. Space missions take a long time to plan and to develop and to build the instruments that go into space, and then you've got to launch them, and get them to where they're going. So I wasn't there when they planned all that, but when it came to the landing time and the time the mission was actually needing to do its science, the team were really busy over in Germany with all the science activities at the European Space Agency, and they said, would I like to take on some of the media engagement stuff? And there was so much interest at the time because it was a really exciting moment for science. No one had ever landed on a comet before. This was fantastic stuff. So I had never really done media stuff. I'd done, talks, and I'd done a bit of, science festivals and things. But, being on front, Sky News and having a camera in your face is just so scary. But
yes.
I found I really loved it. It was weird. I think some people hate it and get very stressed if there's a camera, but I really enjoyed it. And I was like, oh, this is brilliant. This is where I love being. So
I think you may be one media. Of the
few. Yeah, I know. That's what people say, but it was just brilliant. So I got to talk about comets and space science, and it was after that the publisher kind of approached me and said, "Oh, would you like to write a book? Would you be interested?" And I was like, "No, I don't have time. I couldn't possibly do that. I was running a lab at the time and doing my research, and I just knew I didn't have the time to take that on." But then life changed a little bit. I ended up moving out to the US for 3 years, and I left my research career behind, and that was then the perfect time. So I said, you know what? Now I can write this book. So yeah, it was good timing in the end.
Brilliant. And then just going back to your research directions, you had quite a shift then. So you didn't move from, say, doing volcanism on Earth to volcanism in a solar system. You completely switched track to doing comets and asteroid chemistry. So what was your decision and drive behind that decision? Because it's quite a big jump to make that after doing a PhD for a good few years in such a specific area. To make that jump.
Yeah, it is definitely a big jump, but the link was, I always say it's the rocks, because actually rocks on Earth are no different to rocks in space. Okay, yes, they can have different things in them, different minerals, they're made up differently, but ultimately it's all made of rock and it's all made of minerals which make up the rock. So in a way, it doesn't really matter what you're analysing. If you're a geochemist, you can analyse material from Earth or material from space, and what you're doing is then just looking at a different story of what those minerals are telling you. Now, I did geochemistry. So this meant I was using these highly specialized mass spectrometers. These are essentially like big specialized microscopes to drill down to tiny pieces of samples. So we'd take, literally like nanometer sized pieces of rock that we'd be analyzing, tiny weeny pieces. And you basically looking at the elements that those little minerals contain, and then you're building up a picture of how that rock formed. So I could do that with a piece of rock from a volcano from Iceland, and then I could do that with a comet. And with Iceland, I'm going, oh, how did this rock form on Earth? What was the magmatic system inside the Earth that formed it? And with a comet or asteroid, I'm saying, oh, how did this form in the solar system? What can these minerals tell us about the formation of the solar system? So you're just looking at different stories, but you can use the same technique. So this instrument I was using up in Edinburgh for my PhD was called it's some kind of mass spectrometer, and they had a very similar version of it at the Open University. So it was the instrument that led me, because I absolutely loved being in the lab and analyzing samples. And so actually when it said, oh, okay, it's using this instrument to analyze space rocks, I was like, oh, okay, well, that sounds fun. I don't know much about them, but I'm sure I can do the analysis. And then, I had a lot to learn, but, they took a risk with me, I think. And they then, it paid off. I did okay with my research. So it was okay.
All an application of skill set then, as opposed to the actual questions themselves. But as you just said it, I'll always say this. As scientists, we are storytellers. If you're an artist or a scientist, that is what you're trying to do. We use different methods and different techniques, but we're trying to convey a story, whether that's within our own community, to other people within broader sciences, or to the general public.
Yeah,
we tell it in different ways depending on those audiences, but it's that storytelling. And so you've been able to do that from, I'm just realized I had the range of different ways you've been telling stories of science over the years, from highly specialized research papers in cosmochemistry to writing writing books, publishing articles, doing it through media and television, and then doing public events as well.
Yeah. It's a whole range, but I think that's science communication, isn't it? Yeah. And I think when I speak to the researchers that I work with now, and some of them have no experience, communicating their science, and others have more, I always say to them, first of all, we need to find something that you enjoy doing. So for me, I love writing. I'm also very comfortable in front of the camera and speaking to people, but one of my loves is writing. So I say to them, if you're not comfortable speaking to people about your research, then let's write. First of all, start a blog. Or we have at the university this website called OpenLearn, which is a free learning website for the public. So it's aimed at non-specialist audiences, and it's a very accessible site. So, a PhD student can come along and just write an 800-word article about their work. I can work with them to make that accessible. And then they've had a go, and they've had there's just a way in. And it might be that they've then found their passion and they might want to take that further, but also it just improves their skills in general, like being able to simplify your work and make it accessible to a range of audiences is key. And actually, even if you only ever do research papers always need what they call a plain summary of what they're doing, so that anybody can understand it. And so it's a real skill to do that. But once you've kind of worked out how to talk about your science, you can really go anywhere from there. So I like to try and help people find their niche and be like, okay, do you like making animations? We've got someone at the university who does these Lego animations of like research, which is awesome. And
Brilliant.
It's like something, I could never do, but she's brilliant at it. So, she doesn't necessarily, she's not in front of the camera, but she's doing her science storytelling in a different way.
Yeah, as you say, it's something that probably more people need to hear as well, because they're exposed to, maybe a lot of social media. So they say, well, the only way for me to do science communication is for me to be on Twitter or to be on Instagram. But yeah, that's probably just because that's what we put. If you're on social media, that's what you see the most on a daily basis. But
exactly. And TikTok, it petrifies me. I'm not on TikTok, and I don't even know. I'm like such an old granny. I'm like, no, I can't do it. It's passed me by.
Well, but yeah, we evolve with these platforms. We think of new ones, as you said, your colleague using Lego animation, just things that we wouldn't think about. But to find these new ways to get to different people, for me, thinking about what we've done with video games over the years. You've got kids now that know what Obsidian is because they've played Minecraft, or something like that.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, so I think it's just amazing thinking these different ways, that these unconventional ways that we can make more conventional, as long as people know that they're out there. To do. Brilliant. So now I want to talk about your second book, which is what we just briefly mentioned before. So we talked about Catching Stardust, which came out a couple of years ago, but Fire and Ice just came out a couple of months ago, right?
Yes, it did. End of September. It's amazing. I'm just like, oh my goodness, it's flown by though. No, it's getting on for 2 months, and I'm kind of like, oh my goodness, it's been out in the world, and it's kind of a scary, really scary time once I finished it probably a year ago. And then it goes through all, the editing and, proofreading. And then we did the audio book recording. And that was quite fun to kind of have to read it back, because I'd kind of, when I was editing it, I never really read the whole thing through in one go again, because it's just exhausting. And so actually, it takes so much time, and then it goes out to review, and then you're waiting for it to come out and hearing what people think about it. And it's awful. It's like, having your baby judged or something. It's just like, please don't be horrible about it. And luckily, I've been really fortunate. I've had really lovely reviews, and so far, and even on Amazon so far. And I'm like, okay, it must be okay for now then.
Brilliant. How did you find it reading it back to yourself for the audio? Because I feel like, I was going to say a scientist, but really anyone, we're not really great at, watching ourselves back on things, and likewise probably reading what we've already read. I know, if I go back 5-10 years and read an essay or a paper I wrote, I will cringe looking at the way I've written it.
I did a few times, and because every time I read it, like, I don't think a book is ever finished. I think a lot of authors say this. You just get to the point where you've just done as much as you can do, and you're fed up with it, and you're like, it has to go now. So every time you read it, you think, oh, I probably would have changed that, or oh, I should have put that in, or I forgot to mention this. And so there's loads of stuff that you just, you judge it. So the whole time I just had to concentrate so hard for the audiobook recording day, because you obviously can't make any mistakes. You've got to say the exact words that are on there. And it takes so much concentration. Like, I was in this little booth for 3 days, just talking to myself and, reading off an iPad screen, and my eyes were like, oh my goodness. And it was so tiring. Like, that weekend I was completely wiped out of just, the exhaustion of talking. I'm good at talking. I like talking, but 3 days of it nonstop was a bit much.
But as you say, even at the end of this whole process, the book gets released, and then there's still no time to breathe afterwards, because then everybody wants to talk about it. Hence why we're sat here today.
I know, and it's so weird because you spent so long thinking about it and writing about it that actually suddenly talking about the book, it's a really weird transition, because with my first book, I'd been used to talking about comets and asteroids because it was my research. So, and I'd done a lot of public talks about them. So the book sort of came about from that. But with Fire and Ice, I'd never really talked about space volcanoes in public. So I then was, the first few talks I gave, I was constantly making edits afterwards thinking, I could explain that a different way, or I need a better example here from my book. I need to look back through and see what I put in there. And, you just find different ways to explain it, a different order to the talk. And then every podcast I've done or every interview, you just get asked different things, and it's exciting. Every interview is different. That's why I kind of love podcasts, because it's just a really nice conversation and it doesn't feel like, a scary interview. But you find different ways to explain things, and it's fun. It has been tiring though.
Yes. And on that note as well, if anybody listening or watching wants to listen to some of the other podcasts that you've done, Natalie, can they find them on YouTube, on social media?
Yeah, so I guess my website, I collate them all on my website. So that's nataliestarkey.com. And yeah, I try to put all the links to them there. And most of them are kind of on YouTube now. So I do have a YouTube. I don't do much on my YouTube page. I just kind of put stuff on there that other people have put on YouTube. I don't tend to make that many dedicated videos just because I don't have a huge amount of time. But I do have one. So it's got all of it on there. And yeah, I would say every conversation is different. It's funny. It's like you can listen to one and, they'll be completely different to the next one. So yeah. They're good.
That's good to know. So you don't feel like you're coming onto these going, here we go, another one.
Here we go again. Yeah.
It's time to prepare my list of 10 answers. So it's nice to know that you have a different conversation every time.
Yeah, definitely.
And so I guess at this point now we should talk a bit more actually about volcanoes in the solar system. So I'll pose an immediate question to you, which is something that we have a conceived idea on Earth about, and that if you say it to maybe the general public, they'll say, I can understand what this is. What is magma?
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so great question, because as you said, on Earth, we have a pretty good idea. We're like, okay, magma's molten rock in some respect. Because what I do is I think of magma as the molten version of whatever that world is made from. So we take Earth, and our Earth is made of rock. But this magma definition doesn't necessarily work everywhere in the solar system, and certainly not everywhere in the universe. So if we go out to, for example, a moon of Jupiter called Io, that's also made of rock. So if we were to melt that rock and make a magma inside of that world, that's what we get. We get a rocky magma, just like we get here. And actually, interestingly, the magmas on Io are very similar to the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. So like the really early Earth is thought to be really similar to Io. So Io is a really cool little moon for many reasons, but it kind of gives us an insight into the early Earth, which is really exciting. But for example, if we went to, say, Enceladus, which is an icy moon of Saturn, it's not made of rock. Well, it probably has a rocky kind of core, but that's not the bit we melt. The rest of that world is an ice world, or an ocean world, in fact. So it's icy on the outside because it's very cold out in the outer solar system. But then under that, it's got a mantle, just like the Earth. Our mantle is made of rock, and that's where we create magmas. But on Enceladus, that mantle's made of liquid water, probably a salty ocean like our own oceans. So that, in a way, becomes Enceladus's magma, because it's just the molten version of its icy crust. So it really depends where you are in the solar system as to what a magma is. And obviously, magmas become lavas at the surface. So that's often a definition that people aren't aware of. But yeah, lava on the surface, once it comes above the crust, and it will be magma before that. So yes, that's kind of a simple definition. So
when we're thinking about volcanism on other planets from a lava perspective, we're not necessarily envisioning what we may see on Earth at Kilauea on Hawaii, or as currently at the moment, La Palma in the Canary Islands.
Yeah.
But lava on other worlds is out of this world. It looks completely different. It flows differently. It's got a different behavior.
It can do, and sometimes it doesn't. Like, the thing is that we have so many different possibilities out there, and just in the solar system to start with. So, you take Mars and you've got Olympus Mons. Well, that is the biggest volcano in the solar system. It's 25 kilometers high. It's ridiculously big, but it's actually very similar to the volcanoes we find in somewhere like Hawaii. It's made by the same thing inside of Mars or the Earth, this kind of hot chimney of rock that rises up through that planetary body, and then it erupts this lava at the surface, which just piles up in one place. Now, the difference between the two is that Earth, many people are aware, Earth has plate tectonics. So this is where the outside of our planet is broken into pieces like a jigsaw, but they kind of move in relation to each other. Now, Hawaii doesn't really care that plate tectonics happens. Plate tectonics produces our earthquakes and a lot of our volcanoes. But actually, Hawaii couldn't care less. It's just sitting above this mantle plume that keeps on erupting for a long time. But what happens is, as it erupts, the plate that Hawaii is sitting on, which is the Pacific plate, keeps moving because of plate tectonics. So this island chain is formed. So we've got the oldest islands in Hawaii are in the northwest. I was trying to get this right in my head. And the youngest islands are in the southeast. That's correct, isn't it? I've got my map the right way up. So the current volcanism is all on the big island of Hawaii, and that's where the plume is sitting beneath. Now, if we go to Mars all of a sudden, and we look at that same feature, Mars doesn't have plate tectonics. So that mantle plume, this chimney of hot rock, has been erupting in one spot for millions of years. And that meant that Olympus Mons just grew and grew and grew, and it never formed an island, a chain of islands. So that's literally why it's so big. But other than that, those kind of volcanoes are very similar. If you look at them from space, it's quite fascinating. There's some brilliant images you can see, which I always show in talks, because you look at them from satellite. Mauna Kea on Hawaii looks really similar to Mount Olympus Mons, because they're these kind of, that whilst Olympus Mons is high, it's also very wide. So you get these very wide, very flat volcanoes. They're flat but 25 kilometers high. So that's kind of hard to imagine, but they're called shield volcanoes, and that's because they look like a warrior's shield lying on the ground. But they look really, really similar, just different scales. So whilst those are similar, yes, many other lavas that we find out in other bodies in the solar system can behave completely differently. They might be the same composition, they might be made of the same stuff. But if that world you're erupting them onto is a lot smaller and doesn't have as much gravity, or it doesn't have as thick an atmosphere, or it has a thicker atmosphere even, then you're going to create very different deposits on the surface. So this is one thing we can do in space science. It's called comparative planetology. We can go out and take images of all these worlds and compare them to what we know. So we know very well our own Earth system, but we don't know so well all these systems out there in other planets and moons. So what we do is we compare to what we know. And if things look different, say a lava flow has flowed further and they're very long, then we can go, okay, maybe that lava was more fluid, or maybe that world is hotter, or it was hotter when that stuff erupted. It's things like that. It's very simple science, actually, when you break it down. And it's kind of taking all that information and building up a picture of what that world is like.
Yeah, it's finding those comparisons and then trying to pick out the ingredient that's either missing or that's been added. So as you just said, if we've got similar chemistry, but we've got all these other parameters that we can consider, like you said, for Mars, plate tectonics, also for Mars, gravity. But if you were to go somewhere like Venus, the gravity's relatively similar. The chemistry is very, very similar, but you've got that added effect of an extremely thick and pressurized atmosphere, and therefore a very, very hot surface. So every planetary body, whether it's a planet or a moon, has a completely different ingredient set that you have to translate your knowledge to.
Definitely, yeah. And that's what makes it exciting. I mean, some of that you can sort of forecast and predict from what you know about that body. If it's big, then it's going to have more gravity. If it's small, like a small moon, it's going to have less. So some of that we know before we get there. And then some of that we have to look at the features. And particularly if we're looking back into the past, for example, on Mars, well, we now know that, in the past it had water on its surface, but we don't see water today. But what we see is the deposits of that were left behind when water flowed on the surface, or the interactions that volcanoes had with, lakes and stuff that were on the surface of Mars. So it's picking apart all those details and figuring out, what was Mars like 3 billion years ago? Could it have housed life at one point? Well, that's one of the things that I think the 6 missions at Mars currently, that are currently there are looking for. Do we want to answer these questions?
Yeah. And now Venus has got the attention.
It has, isn't it exciting? Yes. I know. It's got like 4 or maybe even 5 missions
now. Is it
now,
5 now? Wow, I need to keep up.
Yeah, there's one that's going to be going somewhere else, but taking a flyby on the way. So we've got, 2 NASA missions, an ESA, an Indian one. I can't remember. Is it the United Arab Emirates have one? I think they have one as well. So it's just going to be fast. I think it's the new Mars. I keep on saying this, but I think, I'm not bored of Mars. There's still a lot to learn.
I want to get us to Venus.
But exactly, it's such a fascinating world. I mean, one of the things about Venus, obviously, its surface is hot enough to melt lead. So it's very inhospitable, even for spacecraft. We can't land on there and roam the surface like we do on Mars. It's just not possible. I think the last spacecraft that landed there lasted just a few hours before being crushed to death. And that would happen to any future spacecraft. But there's still a lot we can learn by looking at its atmosphere, diving down and taking measurements whilst we're on our way to a death at the surface. There's still a lot we can learn. And the surface is, it's even thought to be like Play-Doh because it's so hot that the crust, which would be like Earth, as hard as rock that we have on Earth, might be kind of soft and Play-Doh-y, which is kind of weird to imagine that, that's the kind of surface you'd be on. But we've got a lot to learn. It's going to be really exciting.
And even then, as well as that weird surface, that air, the air that you would be breathing if you were down on the surface is actually a supercritical carbon dioxide fluid.
Yes, it wouldn't be very nice.
Yeah, it's a very, very strange world, but there's potential up there in the atmosphere. I think one of my favorite facts for Venus that always translates for me, because I look at a lot of like volcanoes in the ocean, is that the surface pressure on the surface, if you would stand on the surface of Venus and get very, very hot, the pressure you would feel there is the same as if you were 900 meters deep in the ocean.
Oh, really?
It's
Okay.
The equivalent pressure, very different realms. So there's actually, you're talking about like comparative planetology. There's a lot of areas where we can use our knowledge of the sea, like volcanoes on the seafloor, and try and translate it to Venus. Both very, very hard environments to image and study, but potentially
that's one of the
translatable.
things, isn't it? About, I think a lot of people don't realize that we have all these volcanoes on the bottom of the ocean. And that's something I talk about in the book. But, what is it, 70,000 kilometers of volcanoes or something, stretching around the planet. And they're really inaccessible. Trying to actually study those is it's just as hard as going into space because we can't survive down there. If we send equipment down, it's dark, the pressures are ridiculous, the temperatures are silly. Often it could be very acidic environments. None of this is great for robots or for humans. And that's just like going into space, So it's kind of fascinating that we haven't explored them more because it's on our own planet. We should know everything about it, but they are just, 4 kilometers depth in some cases. It's a long way to go down, isn't it?
And who knows, maybe the more we learn about Venus, we'll actually learn more about the seafloor.
Yeah.
From doing it that way around.
You never know.
You never know. So on that note, I want to ask you over the course of your career and all the amazing things that you've done, is there a standout moment for you? Is there that memorable volcano-related experience, whether that's research or something you've done in your life, a trip even?
Yeah, I'll try to tell this story fairly succinctly because it's one that I could sit in a pub and talk about all evening. But I got the chance to go out to the Caribbean to study, to work at a volcano out there on Montserrat, which is called the Soufriere Hills. It's a British overseas territory, this small island just near Antigua. And so I went out for 3 months to study the volcano as a break from my PhD and just to do some fun volcanology on an active volcano. Now, I needed to fund this trip because I was an impoverished student. And my supervisor at the time at Edinburgh had a fund that had been left to him by this lady that he knew in Edinburgh, who'd said she was leaving all her money to him for students that wanted to go on field work and they had to be doing something exciting. And so, I applied, I got some money to go. Now, there was one condition with this money, and it was that you had to take a little bag of her ashes with you to scatter wherever you went. So, people before me, many people, geologists, had gone to different places, and so she was scattered various points around the world. So there I set off to the Caribbean with this little bag of ashes that looks not dissimilar to a little bag of drugs, I imagine.
No.
So I have them in my bag. Now, I didn't really consider this until I got through customs in Montserrat, and it was all, it's a very small island, it's all very friendly, but I suddenly realised I put the little bag of ashes into my walking boots just to keep it all tucked away safely whilst I travelled. And they started going through my bag and I was, oh my goodness, what have I done? How am I going to explain this? Because I hadn't put any information in my bag about this. I just stuck it in, not thinking anything about it. So there was Sheila, as everyone called her, my travel companion, in my boots. And luckily they looked through, they saw my socks in there, and they didn't go any further, and they left Sheila in my shoes. So I got through customs with, I was just sweating, stressed out. But anyway, I then had to tell the MVO team, so the Montserrat Volcano Observatory team, and the guy used to come over from Antigua with the helicopter for us to go and do our field work. So I told him one day, I need to scatter Sheila somewhere. Can we go and, do this as part of our fieldwork today? So they were all very good, and off we went. So Sheila got scattered on one of the peaks overlooking the active volcano of Montserrat. So she will be forever there, scattered into the ashes of the volcano with her ashes. And so it's an amazing story. It's a weird one because it's kind of a weird request. But I think my supervisor at Edinburgh has a map of where Sheila is around the world now. So it's sweet, right? It's kind of sweet, but also kind of weird. But, luckily I didn't, get put in a prison in Montserrat. So that was good.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for everything you've talked to us about today. That there's so much more that we could talk about on each of all these little things. And I'm glad that we've hit so many of them. But like I said, if you do want to, watch or listen to any more of Natalie's podcasts that she's done, you can go to her website or have a look on YouTube. We'll put the links into the descriptions for these below, so you'll be able to find them, and also on our website. And just as a final plug for you to make sure you go out, but I'm holding up the book right now for those listening.
Where's mine?
Yep.
Hold on, we can both do it.
There we go.
There's mine as well.
So this is a reminder for you all to find Fire and Ice, Volcanoes of the Solar System, and you can learn more about the things we've talked about today. So I'll just say a final thank you, Natalie, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
No problem. All the best.